Linux Luddites, episode 91, for the 14th of November, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. Later on, Jesse will be giving us his take on the Linux Voice team's new home, and we'll be spinning up a tiling window manager that was suggested to us by a listener. And after your feedback, we'll also be talking with Elizabeth K. Joseph about OpenStack, and her book, which offers some good basic footholds, I think, for this complex piece of infrastructure. But before we get into all of that, you guys been up to anything exciting since last time?
Well, actually, I wanted to ask our audience a question, if I just may take this small opportunity. I'm interested in making some things with 3D printed materials. There's a couple of things around the house that I want to make. And I just wondered if any of our audience had experience on either the software side, so sort of CAD software on Linux, or some sort of 3D making software on Linux, and or also the hardware side. So, you know, whether they've used any websites for getting things made and posted them, and what sort of file formats, all that kind of stuff. I know there's always these suggestions online, but I think that our audience normally has a better grasp of these sorts of things. So if anyone's got any experience with that and could give me a few pointers as maybe what they've used, I'd appreciate that.
I think it's Christmas trees, isn't it?
Are you saying that's what I need to make?
No, that's the only thing I can think of that's been mentioned on a Linux podcast ever about 3D printing. And Laura on the Ubuntu podcast talked about Christmas trees once.
No, nothing as sort of ornate as that.
It's funny that I was thinking about 3D printing a part for a suitcase, weirdly. The internal, the thing that slides up and becomes the handle, that had snapped off inside. I managed to find a way to fix it otherwise, but if I'd had a 3D printer, I could have fixed it much more easily. Yeah,
but you'd have made it out of like a kind of fairly low strength kind of naff plastic that's not really, I don't think it's that well bonded together. I think it's not really ideal for that sort of wear and tear that you get with slamming suitcases around the place.
Yeah, I think you can have different types of plastic, but I don't know. Maybe you're right. I don't know enough about this. I probably shouldn't comment.
So no, other than that, my sort of to be done work and some things that we're doing on future show topics. Not a lot over the last couple of weeks. And I know we talked about it off air, same for Joe, so let's just get on with the news.
Well, first up in the news is some bad news that Mythbuntu is no more. Certainly not as a standalone distro. And Mythbuntu was, I suppose you'd say, a flavour of Ubuntu, an official one, that bundled Myth TV and had it all set up nicely, working out of the box. But the bottom line is that their developer base has dwindled from double figures to about 2. And so they just don't have time to do it as a standalone distro anymore.
It seems to be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth over this, and I've never used it. Was Myth TV really difficult to set up? I mean, was that why it was quite liked?
That's what everyone says, but I don't own a TV, cha-ching, so I've never tried it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the whole point is that you don't own a TV, and that's why you have a TV on your computer. This is for people like you, Joe. So you put a TV capture card in the PCI slot, and then off you go. And in fact, back at university, I borrowed exactly that, a TV capture card off a friend and installed, I think it was straight Myth TV rather than Mythbuntu, and it was a pain to do. There's a lot of configs to set up where your nearest cell tower was, not cell tower, aerial tower was, and things like this. But I did get it working, but it wasn't really that useful for me. I wanted mostly to save stuff to a local hard disk. And I think Mythbuntu just meant you could get round all that. But I also think it's maybe a reflection of the times where people aren't watching TV on their computer so much, or there are other ways of getting the content straight from the internet, what have you, rather than have to have a or multiple capture cards. HD capture cards quite expensive. You've got to have good aerial connection, all these sorts of things. There's a lot of hurdles to get it. And so I think it's probably just a reflection of how many people are interested in this particular technology.
But the good news is that they are going to keep maintaining a PPA, so you can just install a flavor of Ubuntu, straight Ubuntu or Ubuntu or whatever, and install this PPA and then have more or less what you had in the first place. And we've actually spoken about that before, haven't we? That why do you need a separate distro for stuff like this? A completely different ISO and all the rest of it, when just a PPA will do, or additional repositories on whatever other type of distro. So I don't think that it is truly Mythbuntu dying. It's just kind of Mythbuntu as we know it.
Well, it's one Ubuntu official flavor down, one Ubuntu official flavor up. Oh, managed to spit them out eventually. And this is the news that what was Ubuntu Budgie Remix has now been sanctioned as an official flavor and will be in 1704, its first release as Ubuntu Budgie. Now, they first came out in 1604 with this Budgie Remix version. They've then had an update, 1604.1, and they're on schedule to release for 1610. But as I say, that's still going to be a remix version, and the first official Ubuntu Budgie will be 1704. And it gets benefits like the Ubuntu build service, and also the community gets additional benefits being part of the official Ubuntu family. Things like Ask Ubuntu and the Ubuntu forums and Launchpad.net, all these sorts of things.
Well, we've seen the good that it did for Ubuntu Mate, haven't we? Ubuntu Mate was trucking along nicely, and then they got official flavor status, and they've just kind of run with it from there and utilized all those things that you said there. So it's good news. I mean, it's not something that I have a massive interest in. I must say, yet another GTK desktop that is sensibly laid out. We've got plenty of those already. But Budgie, which comes from Solus, of course, is a very popular desktop, and people obviously must be using this, otherwise they wouldn't continue to make it. So it's always good, I think. Choice is always good. But for me, it's just not something that I'm going to choose to use, I don't suppose.
I will play this back to you in a year's time when XFCE has actually died, and we'll see which desktop you choose.
XFCE will never die. Don't say those things.
It's like Emacs. You just can't get rid of it. On the 10th of November, the Fedora team, moving on to a completely different base distro, announced the predictably sort of delayed version 25 would actually support MP3 playback. Now, codec support apparently won't be there out of the box, but it will be a lot simpler to install than in the past. And there are suggestions that the project from version 26 onwards will actually ship it.
This is just playback though, isn't it? No encoding, so no lame, which you generally don't get in any distro. So whenever I've had to export stuff from Audacity, it always tells you need to go off and download the binary and stuff like that. But it does seem unusual, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is the support's not been provided before because Red Hat and Fedora are based in the US, and their legal team has been worried about the patent situation around MP3. I mean, obviously that doesn't impact people or is a concern for people working outside of the US. So distros like Ubuntu and SUSE, say, which are both based in Europe, have been merrily shipping this sort of functionality for years now.
But always as an add-on, or actually you do with Ubuntu now, you just have to tick the box during installation, or that's been for a long time now. But it's, generally speaking, it's not going to be out of the box unless you actively choose it. So Fedora would, in a way, be unique, apart from Mint, which seems to not really care. Oh no, even they don't ship the codecs anymore, do they? So Fedora, if in 26 they do have this out of the box without even having to tick any boxes during the installation, that would be unusual. Although I always think about Triskel, and I remember when we reviewed that, being surprised that MP3s played no problem. And someone replied at the time saying that, well, just because it's free software doesn't mean there aren't free software implementations of MP3. But I thought it was more about the patent stuff rather than the free software, because VLC plays it out of the box, and that's completely free software, isn't it? So I don't really see what's changed for Fedora here.
No, that's what I've been doing some digging on, and no one has actually come out and said what's changed. And clearly the legal team at Red Hat have decided something has changed. I couldn't find anything on expiry of patents. And all the team members are just saying all they know is that legal have told them they can use it now. So,
yeah, but maybe this is a little bit like Ubuntu and ZFS, where nothing changed in ZFS. That the rules and regulations didn't change. It's just that Ubuntu sort of decided that their interpretation of the interface between ZFS and the Linux kernel was acceptable, and so they shipped it and just waited for the backlash. And perhaps Fedora decided that, well, this might be the same thing.
I find that difficult to believe, though, because Red Hat is such a, well, I don't know, I was going to say a proper company, not like Canonical. They're a $2 billion company with an awful lot to lose.
Yeah, so is Canonical. But look at the amount they have to win. I mean, on Canonical side, the win is the fact that you can get ZFS on a server with Ubuntu, and that is obviously where they make a vast amount of their money. So that makes a lot of sense. But Fedora and MP3s is sort of a bit yesterday, isn't it? Like you say, if you're not having MP3 support out of the box, everyone thinks that's entirely normal. You have to tick a box on Ubuntu. There are many workarounds on all these different distros that it's just normal. So, and MP3s, like I say, well, with the piece about Ubuntu, a lot of people stream now, so you don't need the local codec support and things. It just seems a bit sort of yesterday, strangely.
Well, we'll have to wait and see whether anything comes of it. I think you're probably right, Jesse, that it's not really a big enough deal for anyone to jump on them. So let's move on and talk about Munich. And Munich, the city in Germany, of course, is famous for moving a lot of their IT infrastructure over to Linux, albeit quite slowly and carefully with applications first. And it's kind of the poster child for getting rid of Windows and Microsoft and switching to free software. And back in August, we talked about a report that was being prepared that was quite negative about the various users' experience of Linux and whether or not it was actually saving them any money, and was thinking about going back to Windows. Well, that report has now been finished, and so this is back in the news. And it seems that not a lot has really changed. We kind of knew what the report was going to say, and here we are. We're now worried that Munich is going to change back to Microsoft products and get rid of Linux. And I remember talking about how this ancient Linux distro that's like, I think, an old version of KDE and an old version of Ubuntu, no wonder they didn't like it. But it's still potentially bad news, isn't it? That if this does happen, if they do go back to Microsoft products, then there goes our poster child.
Well, this was partly why I put it in the news, because, as you say, not much has changed. They're sort of considering options still. But the fact that it even made the tech press, the story, should be a concern to us, that we have so few of these installations. And I know other podcasts have a regular slot of like where Linux is being used. And the fact we do that, and the fact that it isn't totally ubiquitous everywhere, I think is the big story here, really.
Totally ubiquitous and very unique, eh?
Indeed, very unique. Yes. All right, Mr. Picky. But you know what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah.
That these sort of things are in the news simply because they are aberrations, the fact that this particular council is using Linux.
The same as recently there's been the news that Linux has been at 3% market share for a quarter or two, something like that. There's some
2%, just over 2%.
Yeah. Okay, there's me blowing the numbers out of proportion. 2%, sorry, and that's like news. But if we were at 41 versus 42%, no one would even blink. It's because we're dealing with such tiny little segments that it's interesting when it's gone from 1 to 2. And the same with these, where you've got these big cities in Germany. We've been talking about some of the French government departments, cities in Italy that have moved over. Because there's a handful of them, when you lose one, it's like quite a big loss, because it's just not that common to have it yet.
And what about this wildly speculative conspiracy theory that just because Microsoft moved their German headquarters to Munich in September, that now suddenly Munich's thinking about going back to Microsoft products? Yeah, don't suppose there's much in that theory, eh?
All right, Mr. Conspiracy Theory, we're not going down that path yet. So let's move on and cover a topic that we talked on the last show, which is about Lenovo. And they had these laptops, they're sort of fancy yoga pads that could flip back on themselves and detach and all these sorts of things. And you weren't able to install Linux on them. And they've since announced that they are going to be releasing a series of updates to the firmware to allow you to install Linux. So they heard the outcry, decided the PR was not worth it, and have done something about it. Now, the thing that I'm confused about is that when we covered it, it was basically a case of they want to have a certain level of performance, and to get that performance from Windows 10 and the hardware they had, they'd selected, I think it was a particular SSD, and it was Intel's implementation of the firmware for that SSD that locked Linux out. And so we sort of concluded that it was Intel's problem. But this is Lenovo making the announcement that you're able to run Linux on there.
Well, wasn't it a case of in the EFI, you couldn't change the mode from RAID to kind of standard SATA or IDE or legacy, whatever they call it? They just disabled that because there was no point, because it wouldn't work properly with Windows. And so I think that this idea that they were trying to lock people out of using Linux, I think that is giving them too much credit almost. I think it was just a case of they didn't care. They didn't think that people would want to run Linux on it. And now people have said that they do. They've said, okay, well, we'll just put that switch back in then and make it trivial for you to do so. But they have been very clear to say that, well, you can now run Linux on it, but good luck. It's not going to be very good. You're much better off with Windows.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And I think you're right that they haven't actively stopped people from installing Linux. They've just made sure that they're big market share, and it is shipping with Windows, so of course you're going to make it run well on Windows. And why would you put the extra effort in to allow other operating systems to be installed? You might as well just make it easy for the majority of your customers.
Yeah, the 98% who are not running Linux.
Well, let's stick with Intel, and they've just released the source code for IWD, which apparently is a new network daemon that's intended to replace WPA supplicants. Whilst it was supposedly originally designed for embedded systems, judging from the talk I watched that was recorded at the Systemd Shindig in Berlin recently, I think we might end up seeing this being used more widely, to be honest.
Now, I must say that this is lower level than I fully understand, to put it mildly. But I heard chatter that it is just more Systemd taking over everything. What do you think about that, Paddy?
Well, historically, WPA supplicant's been available not just on Linux, it's also been there for BSDs, and even Mac and Windows can run it. And the new version looks to be tied into Systemd a lot more closely, so I should think that's going to change that situation. So whether that chatter is totally inaccurate, I would probably guess not.
But it is open source now, so it presumably could be adapted if you were technical enough.
I guess so, but it's probably like the rest of Systemd, to be honest, and they just keep moving things forward at such a pace that people can't keep up. So the fact it's open source is totally irrelevant. It makes replication impossible for anybody other than a very well-funded and staffed organisation, and we don't have those generally, apart from people that have totally bought into Systemd in this community. So, yeah, we'll have to see how it shakes out, and it'll no doubt make everyone's life a lot easier, as Systemd, as a generality, has done, but ease does not always equal openness.
Well, we'll see how Systemd/Linux continues to grow. But changing subject a little bit, StatCounter have come out with a report that suggests that mobile and tablet internet usage has finally overtaken that of the desktop. It finally got to the point where it's 51.3 versus 48.7. And if you look at a graph from kind of 2009 to now, it's just this inevitable coming together, whereas there was virtually no mobile and tablet usage in 2009. And now it's got to the point where it's 50-50 and in fact crossed over.
Yeah, you have to explain what the graph shows. So one line is PC usage at the top at 100% going down, obviously. And as you total the pair, it always makes 100%. And so the other one is creeping up. And it's basically like a triangle, isn't it? They've both come together and crossed over. And I have to say, I'm not really that surprised. If I think about the ways that I browse the web, if I didn't sit in an office at a PC that was on the web, I think almost definitely use that, interface the web more through my phone than I do through a PC. Like if I just look at my home usage, it's far exceeded by phone usage on the internet than my PC or my laptop. So while I am probably using the web more via the PC, it's only because I'm at an office doing it all day long, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So this isn't shocking to me, given how many people in India and China, what have you. We always cover this topic that the first time they get in the internet and are able to browse the web is via mobile phones. This seems, if anything, late coming to the party.
Oh, I'm going to have to take exception there. I don't think it's surprising. I think you're right on that score, but I still think it's pretty staggering if you think it's only been 7 years that it's gone from 100% desktop use to only half desktop use and half mobile. Where mobile has come in 7 years is quite incredible.
Well, is it really that incredible? Because it's just so much more convenient for people. Especially, it's easy for us to say in our Linux bubble where you've got a machine that runs nice and quickly, starts up quickly, and everything works fine. But if you've got a choice between an iPad or an iPhone or an Android equivalent and a fairly powerful laptop running Windows that is dog slow because it's got all of this malware and whatever. Even I'll take that back. Even without malware, Windows, for my experience, is just horrible. And of course, you're going to pick the iPad over the crusty old laptop. So to me, it's not a huge surprise because in most people's experience, it is a better experience on mobile. And I do include tablets in that. But even with the bigger phones now, and if you've got a reasonably good Android phone or any iPhone pretty much, you're going to have a better experience than you have with a Windows laptop.
Yeah, but on Paddy's point, if you imagine when usable PCs came out, not one of these ones that's in a room somewhere, but usable PCs that the public could access, or even when the internet came to PCs in, XP kind of times, how long did it take for every household, every person to get a laptop? It's still slowly creeping out to the whole population. Whereas, and that's taken decades, whereas phones have gone from a thing that could only make phone calls to half the internet. I think when Paddy puts in those terms of phone usage in 7 years, it is surprising how rapidly they've become, the mainstay of people's lives on the internet.
I suppose so, and it does make you think that what if we had another major innovation, be it something a little bit like Google Glass, but not as cumbersome,
like watches.
Well, no, I mean, watches are an accessory, aren't they? They're a supplementary accessory to a phone on the whole. But I'm thinking more, suppose you could have some sort of eye implant or whatever, where you could have a kind of augmented reality type overlay or, something like that. So it's something that people are working on, but we don't have yet. How long would it take for something like that to become such a standard thing that it overtakes mobile? Could it be even quicker the next time round is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And I know that you don't mean that an eye augmented reality is the only option. It could be, I don't know, something in your skin or like Google Glass, like you're pointing out, or some sort of clever screen that projects onto your hand and then you can put it away again so it's really small, but you still have a big screen. Something that we haven't thought of yet.
It's likely something that we can't even conceive of yet. But I just threw that eye retina, thing just because that's the first kind of that's the futuristic thing that you'll think of. But yeah, what I'm saying is, it's something that would be a true innovation that potentially no one's even thought of yet.
I was about to try and answer your question, but I've realised it's an impossible question to answer. Who knows what it would cost? Because I mean, the reason that phones are so popular is in those 7 years, they've gone from something that people can't afford to something that absolutely everyone can afford. A £50 phone brings you the internet almost as well as a £500 phone, and they are available at 50 quid, 20 quid. Whereas you'd have to have whatever this new technology is, however it works, would have to come down in price that quickly. I think that's the difference, is that the phone didn't have any actually unique bits of technology in it. It's got batteries, it's got GPS, it's got screen, touchscreen, these sorts of things, which had all been made already. They just need to be made smaller and smashed into the same area of space. And now you can make those really cheap and really fast. So whatever it is would have to have that same, those same sort of properties. But anyway, I think we're well and truly in the strange sci-fi world of what if and what is next. So we'll move on to something in the here and now, and this is a preview of WebAssembly and the three giants of the internet, Google, Microsoft, and Mozilla, have released this preview, and it allows you to run C and C++ code in web browsers natively. And the claim is that it's up to 20 times faster than JavaScript. Mozilla say that they've run tests and it's sort of 1.13 times slower than native speed. So that's the sort of, the inverse of your 20 times. And it's supposed to be better for running things like streaming videos, games, virtual reality, these sorts of things that really require local native performance. But you can now get it through a web browser.
Well, anything's got to be better than JavaScript, surely. And that's the whole point of this, isn't it? We're kind of stuck in this JavaScript world at the moment, and it's just never going to compete with proper applications that are running natively, whereas this WebAssembly sounds like it might actually do that.
Yeah, so we've got the browser as the operating system. Is that a good thing?
Well, it's funny, I was reading this thinking that, the browser is the operating system, and just imagine if you had an operating system that was just a browser. Imagine if one of these companies was doing that. It seems that this is very much in Google's favor, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly in comparison with Microsoft. I mean, Apple, I think, has got a slightly different business model, so whether Safari goes down this route is less important to them because they make money on hardware, or at least they used to when they sell half-decent hardware. But it is a huge change, and I mean, it's obviously going to have implications around things like DRM, I should think, as well.
I'm afraid, Per, I do have to ask, in what way?
Well, if you've got individually written applications there that are all proprietary running inside your browser that can do decoding and stuff and enforce DRM, it doesn't matter what the hell any of the browser manufacturers decide to do about it as a standard. Yeah,
especially given that the encrypted media extensions is going to become part of the standard. It means that DRM is basically just inevitable. And if you haven't got individually local apps, for example, VLC, to play your videos, if it's all happening within the browser, then whoever is controlling the browser controls the software that you're using. It's less freedom and less control, more importantly. And probably, even if you've got a completely free software browser, it's still going to be running more and more proprietary code that is running, half on someone else's computer and half in your browser.
Well, it certainly looks like a bit of a mixed future there, I think. Let's make it a little bit more positive, though. And we've reported before about how the battery API in your browser, I'll repeat that in case you missed it, the battery API in your browser could be used to help fingerprint and track you. The sales pitch we've heard before is that it would allow websites to serve you lighter content if you're low on power. But if that seems like a slightly dubious use case and claim, then we've certainly echoed that in the past as well. Anyway, numerous people pointed out the privacy issues around this functionality, and at the end of last month, Mozilla quietly ripped the API out of Firefox altogether, and Apple have since followed suit with WebKit earlier this month.
So these are browser manufacturers who are listening to the public about concerns over privacy and removing functionality from their browsers?
Yeah, it's very unusual, but it's very good, isn't it? Because there was just no real argument for having this in there, and it almost sort of got in accidentally, and now they've realized their mistake, and now they're ripping it out, which is, I think they've got to be applauded for that.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, the functionality in the first place does sound like something someone dreamt up as wouldn't it be nice if, but I can't imagine there are that many people writing websites who have a second website that loads in case your phone is low on battery or your laptop's low on battery. It just sounds like it was a hole waiting to be exploited.
Yeah, I wonder if part of this is down to Google AMP, where obviously a lot lighter pages are going to be served via that, and people are being leaned on slightly to go down that route.
We say are being served like that all the time. Almost everything I search for has got an AMP site these days.
Yeah, I've got to say, since we covered that story, I've seen more and more results on my phone come up as AMP. And had we not covered that story, I'm not sure I would have really known what AMP and a lightning bolt meant. So, I'm glad we're doing the news.
Yeah, and I really like those AMP sites on the whole because it does load incredibly quickly and it doesn't have loads of rubbish on there that I don't want to see. It's just the content that I want to read generally. But that's a bit of a rabbit hole that we could probably go down again, and we probably shouldn't. But let's stick with Mozilla, and they have introduced FlyWeb, which is a new system to control Internet of Things devices and have Internet of Things devices communicate with each other on a local basis, rather than needing an external server or even to some extent routers locally. You can have these machines talk to each other in a new and open way that kind of takes back control, which seems like a very good idea, at least in theory, although there is a very new project that has got potentially quite a lot of security holes and certainly implications. But I think that as a general idea and something that they've put out there as a prototype, it seems positive to me.
And of course, as a browser company, then everything looks like a browser problem, doesn't it? So what we're talking about here is basically spinning up a web server within a web page so the devices can talk to each other. So your local device will spin up a web server for another device to talk to. And that is the protocol level we're talking at, is HTTPS.
You sound rather skeptical, Betty, I must say.
I'm generally skeptical about Mozilla. And I mean, Stuart Langridge and I both tried to get FlyWeb guys to talk to us on Twitter. I understand why they probably wouldn't want to talk to me. I'm not a very important little person, but Stuart's pretty well known in the industry. And as usually happens when you try and engage Mozilla, they just totally ignored us. We had no response from them whatsoever. And I think that just speaks to the arrogance of the company that sort of is happily sat there getting all these millions in. I mean, we had a story in the news a while back about how even if they broke off their current deal for search traffic, they'd still get $1 billion out of it. I mean, they get money for doing nothing, basically, and they can go down all these little rabbit holes and not have to justify themselves to anyone. I mean, potentially this does sound like an interesting approach, to be honest, and previous attempts at it that Stuart and I were talking about happened with the Opera team previously, but that was going via servers up in the cloud, and as you said, this is purely local, which is quite different, and I think is a huge selling point here. But it would be nice to be able to get someone from the team to actually talk to us about it.
Well, anyone who's listening who works at Mozilla, maybe you could send an internal email to the team and get them to come on and talk to us about it. But that'll do it for the news then. Let's move on. On the last show, we talked about the end of Linux Voice magazine as a standalone product and the fact that they were merging with Linux Magazine. Well, Jesse, you were a subscriber to Linux Voice, and therefore you have been sent one of these Linux magazines. And I thought that we'll not spend too long talking about this, but just briefly, what you think of it.
Yeah, so I hold in my hand a copy of Linux Magazine. This is the pages rustling. And so I've never bought Linux Magazine before. I've bought other ones, but I've never one of these particular publications. They're part of the Linux New Media group, and there's an umbrella of different magazines under that banner. Now, just the first thing I thought when I heard that Linux Voice was going to become part of another magazine, I thought, well, how much of that magazine is going to be Linux Voice, and how much of it is going to be the original magazine? So, fortunately, for percentage terms, this magazine is exactly cover to cover 100 pages long. So it makes my percentage numbers really, really easy. So Linux Magazine has 50 pages worth of content, and Linux Voice has 30 pages worth of content. And the rest of the 20 pages are things like the contents, adverts, what's coming up next week or next month, whatever you. So, non-content sorts of things. So it's sort of a 50-30 split between the Linux magazine and Linux Voice. Now, obviously, for that to happen, Linux Voice have had to cut down on the amount of content they produce. So I did a little comparison as to what the parts of the Linux Voice magazine have been kept and which ones had been chopped. So there's a couple of editorial pieces. They've got core technology, FAQ, where they take maybe a lesser known area and then discuss it and describe it. They've got a review. They've got FOSPICs, a little bit of gaming, and a couple of tutorials. Now, normally they would have had feedback. They'd have done a group test, a masterclass, some topics on DistroHopper, and there would be more tutorials. There'd be more than one review. I mean, in one of the magazines that I picked up just to compare between Linux Magazine and Linux Voice, there was 5 reviews. So they have had to cut down a lot, and neither Linux Magazine nor Linux Voice specifically talk about, numbers and things, finances and things, but they do both make a really good job of sort of welcoming Linux Voice readers, explaining roughly why this move had to happen. I just did a quick add up also of how many articles the 4 key members did. So Ben did 2, Mike did 2, Andrew did 1, and Graham did 1. So it gives you an idea, and I should also say that they have more content than that. They've just got, extra writers come in and add various articles as well. But that gives you an idea as to how much time these guys now have to follow other interests and do other work and find other ways of financing their lives, because the point is that it wasn't bringing in enough money for the amount of time they were spending on it, and something had to be done to allow them to continue producing content, albeit at a lesser rate, and carry on doing the podcast and everything.
So it sounds like the Linux Voice section of Linux Magazine is much the same as it was before, but just a cut down version of it, condensed. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. They've cut down some of the things that maybe took a lot longer to do. Group tests, for example, when we do them, they take a long time. DistroHopper is not necessary. It's just loading up an ISO. Feedback, for example, noting that there is no feedback in the main Linux magazine either. They do a Ask an Expert type section, but there's no feedback there. So yeah, you're right. They've sort of taken the magazine, chopped down the number of reviews they do, chopped down some of the segments entirely to get a much lesser magazine. However, I did like the fact that it was a big chunk of the magazine. It wasn't like 3 or 4 pages. I'd say it's 30 pages. It's still a significant amount of the magazine. You still feel like you're reading a cut down copy of Linux Voice.
Right. And so that leads me to Linux Magazine then. How does that compare to Linux Voice? Because Linux Voice to me was always, it wasn't necessarily aimed at new users, but it sort of covered the range quite well, I thought. In fact, very well. It would appeal to experienced users and new users alike. Whereas the reputation Linux Magazine has is more aimed at sysadmins and people who are, well, it's sort of less desktop Linux focused and much more, like what we're going to talk to Liz about later, OpenStack, that kind of thing. And is that reputation fair?
Yeah, it is. So, for example, they have 3 pages on kernel news. So, you open it up, there's 2 pages of news, similar to what Linux Voice had originally, where you just got sort of snippets to cover news, because in a monthly magazine, it's very difficult to cover the news and be fresh. But then they have 3 pages worth of kernel news, and I've never seen that in any Linux magazine before. So they do definitely sort of go for the more hardcore Linux, the more detailed, in-depth sort of reviews and things. And then there's a huge section of reviews. Let me just give you an example of the sorts of topics they're covering, just to give the listener some sort of idea as to what they're looking at. So, I mean, in this magazine in particular, they've reviewed Skype for Linux, done a sort of comparison of Office suites, and then they have sort of 20 pages worth of what they call in-depth, and that's either 1 or 2 pages on each of these, so deep learning. And in this example, they talk about how you can take a photo, and then using GIMP and some deep learning cleverness, you can decompose that image, and then it reproduces it but in color. So it, takes apart the various components, guesses what would look like grass, guesses what looks like a person, those sorts of things, using neural networks and things. So quite a detailed tutorial there with, I think it's 3 or 4 pages. Cryptomator, which has been reviewed on this show, PowerShell in Linux, GNU Social, Cordova, Curl, Termux, and Charterly, like a way of using WhatsApp on the terminal. So those are not outside the realm of what Linux Voice, or indeed what we would have covered, but they are done in a more... I'm not quite sure what the term is, but Linux Voice always had quite a light-hearted kind of easygoing, chatty kind of vibe, your mates down the pub sort of thing. I'm not saying this is overly serious, but it certainly is more focused, let's just say that.
Well, it sounds like Linux Voice have found the right new home then, because it's not just more of the same in Linux Magazine. It provides a contrast, and they've got a sizable section in there, but at the same time, it's more doable for them. It's less of a kind of reach and a stretch for them to produce all that content every month. So here's hoping that they can continue to produce the quality that they did before. It sounds like they're certainly having this first one, and as I said last time, good luck to them. Back on episode 45, we discussed various tiling window managers. And recently, Michael Boyle on Google Plus suggested that we look at herbstluftwm. And so we thought it's been a while. Let's have a look at it. And this is not quite the same as the other tiling window managers that we've looked at previously, in that I think it's less useful out of the box, specifically compared to Awesome, Xmonad, and i3 that we actually looked at on 45.
Yeah, now I know Paddy is going to give me the correct terminology for these things, but whereas those 3 dynamically rearranged the tiles so that as you opened more applications, it would shuffle them left or right or split in particular locations, this one you sort of set up frames, and then within those frames, you can then split that frame into smaller windows, as you would have done in those original tiling window managers. So you can sort of move windows from different frames. But the big difference that I found was that whereas other tiling window managers, when you delete a window, all of the other windows resize and reshape themselves to take up the full desktop again. So you always have an entirely covered desktop. Whereas with Herbstluft,
HLWM.
I've been saying to myself all week, and then at some point with Herbstluft. Whereas with Herbstluft Window Manager, these frames are persistent, not forever, but persistent as you before you destroy them. And so if you delete a window, you just end up with an empty frame. So they don't necessarily rearrange all the time. And so it means that if you want, let's say you've got the left-hand half of the web browser and the right-hand half split into 2 frames, one for a terminal, one for gedit, something very simple. If you were to close gedit, normally you would then end up with a full left and a full right of the other 2 windows. But with this one, if you set up a frame for gedit and you close it, you just see 1/4 of your background. And it means that space is then sort of reserved without reshuffling all the other tiles.
Yeah, I'll stick a video in the show notes that I think is quite informative about this. And the last presenting that suggested this was really useful because if you wanted to, say, open a file browser or something after the event and you wanted it there, that's where it'll appear because that space is reserved for future window opening. I personally found it quite confusing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's confusing when, let's say you've got those 3 tiles that I was explaining with the left and 2 on the right. If you then, you can highlight one of them in particular to make that the active tile. If you open 2 terminals in that, it'll split, as I said, so you end up with 2 terminals in this one tile. And you have to be very aware of what is a tile with a full-sized window and what is a tile with 2 windows within it. Because when you close one of those 2 terminals, the other one, because it's not in its own frame, will take up the full size. And you've got to be really on it to work out, okay, have I split this to make an entirely new frame? Or has it just been split because I've got 2 windows in that frame? So yeah, there is a little bit of care that needs to be taken when you're setting it up. But like the other window managers, you can move active windows around into different tiles and different frames and shuffle them around with various keyboard commands.
And whilst I found the fixed frame aspect of this quite annoying to use sort of as a traditional desktop, if you like, I could see that it would be useful, say, in industrial control machinery and stuff like that, where you're not necessarily sure of how big your monitor's going to be, but if you want certain things in the same place all the time, sort of outputs from various sensors and what have you, in that environment, it would actually make a great deal of sense.
Yeah, or if you've got loads of different servers that you need to SSH into, just knowing that a certain server is in a certain place, it seems like quite a logical way of doing it, rather than with other tiling window managers where it can potentially be moving around. And I said it was called Herbstluft window manager, which actually means autumn air window manager in German, which is, I don't know, is that even relevant to how it works? I suppose not really. And it's released under a simplified BSD license, which keeps you happy, Paddy.
It does, yes. And it's all nice and clean. It's C++ and all the configurations done in a bash script. Unfortunately, the Herbstluft unpronounceable stuff carries on through the configuration because you can control it entirely via a client, which is called Herbstluft Client.
It's kind of HER tab, isn't it?
Yeah, after a while, I guess it would be. But the configuration is excellent, as most tiling window managers are, to be honest. It's a simple file where you just sort of specify which keys you want to do what, and it makes a great deal of sense. One of the things that struck me about this, and did last time we spoke about tiling window managers, is how they handle dialog boxes and windows that generally expect to sort of float around in the front. And the tiling window managers we spoke about last time generally seemed to handle that quite well and actually treated them as floating windows, whereas Herbstluft just sticks that window as a pseudo tile, it calls it, but in the middle of a frame. So it isn't as pretty, if you like, when you are hitting a dialog box as it is on some of the other tiling window managers.
Well, I tried this on my main Archbox and also on my laptop, which is running Chaos. So that's a KDE front end. And because it's got KDE, as we talked about a show or two ago, I was using KDE Connect, which I've sort of grown to love as Joe did. And some messages came through on WhatsApp and they popped up at the top on Herbstluft. And I was sort of surprised that it worked. It's one of those things that because you're using quite an old-fashioned kind of clunky interface, you assume that modern things like phones and KDE Connect is all just far too complicated. But it did all work and they did pop up and there is a way of actually having floating windows. I think it's Mod S and you can go from having them all tiled to having them floating. But it seems a bit pointless. The whole reason for having this window manager is to have them tiled as you need them. It makes more sense in that way.
Now, something I didn't actually try, but I saw in that video that you're going to link to, Paddy, is that it seems to have very good multi-monitor support, which the other ones aren't quite as good at, are they?
It's certainly mixed, I think. I sort of expected you to try this on your projector thing, to be honest. But yeah, all the demonstrations I've seen of it show that working very well out of the box. I mean, other than that, it does have all the usual features you'd expect of a tiling window manager. I mean, there's tags, which are effectively different workspaces, and you can pre-configure applications to appear on whichever workspace you like in certain layouts and what have you. So very much standard. I mean, for me, the standout difference was this idea of frames that remain unless you explicitly close them, whether they're occupied or not.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be its USP, doesn't it? And whether or not you find that useful just really depends on your workflow. For me, I personally think that it is more useful because it's more predictable than the other tiling window managers we've used. But I suppose if you're used to one of the other ones, then it might become a bit annoying.
Yeah, I kept on trying to find ways to have that persistence so that when I booted it up, it already had, one particular split that I wanted and maybe different programs pre-populated in them. And there is undoubtedly a way of doing it in the auto start file that is within the config. But the problem I kept on hitting was that there's not that much documentation. There's not that many people using it. So there doesn't seem to be as many sort of resources to go to. Every time I typed in Herbstluft, it would come up with the same self website or the Git repository. Whereas if you were to use i3, for example, there'd be hundreds of different websites, and if you changed your search criteria, you'd have someone who's got a really complicated one or a simple one, or whatever it may be. I just thought that it's just not in the top benchmark of popular and therefore well documented window managers.
Yeah, it's the example side of stuff that's missing. The man pages are reasonably thorough, but they are the typical sort of man page style. There's even a tutorial one which is actually worth scrolling around through, in that you do need examples from other people and a little bit of explanation rather than just saying what the various commands are you can throw at the client.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me about this, is that if you are willing to put in an awful lot of effort and to configure it exactly how you want it, it's incredibly powerful. But out of the box, it's not intuitive. It's not very usable and useful, really. But it's with a lot of the tiling window, well, with all tiling window managers, they tend to be very powerful if you're willing to configure them. But with this, it seems to be that little bit more powerful than the other ones we looked at, but less usable out of the box.
I actually listened to our episode 45, and that could be an exact cut from that show. I think you made the same point about tiling window managers previously, but you're right, it stays true. You can configure them if you need to, but they're just not as user-friendly as a sort of GUI type desktop environment.
So to wrap it up then, the inevitable question, are you going to keep using it? And for me, no, I don't have the time to invest in it, unfortunately. But what about you two?
If I was to use a tiling window manager and I have a little use case in the back of my head, it would be Xmonad rather than this one.
And likewise, I won't, I'm afraid. And like Jesse, I was listening to episode 45, and I'll say exactly the same thing again, which is that I tend to use ordinary GUI desktop, my XFCE desktop, in exactly the same way as I would use a tiling window manager, which is slinging stuff to the side and taking up half the screen or whatever. And the fact that those sort of desktops now support that functionality means that the use case for keyboard-driven tiling window managers is, I don't know, it's less compelling.
Okay, well, I think there's certainly a use case argument for tiling window managers, and I think that herbstluft is potentially up there with the other ones we looked at before, but it just looks like we don't have that use case for them. On to the feedback then, and first of all, a huge thanks to our PayPal donors, and we had 3 of them: Adam Cox, David Garth Owen, and Victor Vazberg. Sorry, I've definitely butchered that, Victor. And to our new monthly supporter, Michael Lamb, and of course to all of the existing monthly supporters. Thank you very much, everyone. It's really appreciated, and it helps us keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Much appreciated.
So contact details, you can email us show@linuxluddites.com, or if you go to the website, you'll see links to the Twitter and Google Plus and Facebook communities, or you can always leave a comment on the website.
So kicking off the feedback proper then, Sinisha got in touch with us and said, I really enjoyed your interview with Doug Hill in episode 38. His book, Not So Fast, Thinking Twice About Technology, recently became available on Amazon.com. And I was wondering if we'd get another interview with Doug soon. I was really pleased to see Doug's book getting out there, actually in a Dead Tree edition, and we'll stick a link in the show notes to it. If you didn't hear the interview with him back on episode 38, I think it's well worth doing so. We often try and bring some different perspectives on technology to the show, and Doug certainly did that.
Yeah, he was a really fascinating guy. You should definitely have a listen to that if you haven't heard it.
So Campbell Barton got in touch regarding our topic last time, our Over the Pint, and he said, I think there's a strong argument to be made that we have a large body of well-maintained software. People aren't writing new image editors, audio editors, Office suites, C, C++ compilers, etc. on a regular basis. Added to this, the popular open source applications in these areas are fairly well maintained. So I think there is a bias here to focus on projects making big changes, whilst other projects, which are being quietly maintained, don't grab our attention. There are cases when a lot of new developments are valuable too, so I think it's not entirely fair to criticise developers for working in new areas. This is especially true in fields that have a lot of room for improvement. Failing to do so means you risk becoming irrelevant. And I mean, I can think of a lot of bits of software that don't get a lot of maintenance, gedit and other ones that just sit there ticking along nicely. But maybe we were talking more about operating systems. They seem to keep on jumping to the new and shiny. And there are, you hear about these rewrites of video editors and things that go to crowdfunding sites to try and get more money to make big rewrites and have you. So there are examples of what you think are fairly tried and tested and stayed kind of applications that do go out there to try and do rewrites, add features and change where they are. So I suppose you're right. There are some that are sort of plodding along, doing their thing happily, just being maintained. And then there's the ones that Paddy was talking about, which are sort of programming for programming's sake.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my emphasis was on the fact that if you muck around with toolkits and what have you, often that has a knock-on effect that forces changes downstream with all these other actual applications that utilise them. But as we were talking about engineering and making several very dodgy analogies to house building and such like last time, Florian got in touch and said, about the engineering side of things, what about building airplanes and cars? Their technologies move quite a bit faster than the one of building bridges. I'm not talking about the Internet of Toasters here, more like airbags, ABS, or the more recent new requirements on emissions. Isn't this engineering too? And it is, but there's a huge difference between an awful lot of stuff in the real world as opposed to stuff that sits on our computer. And it's partly down to updatability, I think, because a lot of real-world goods don't get updates, have never had updates. Early computers never used to get updates. I mean, when I went out and bought my Sinclair Spectrum or whatever, the ROM was the ROM was the ROM. And if it didn't work, then the company would have a hell of a job actually recalling the machines and putting out new stuff. So a lot more effort, I think, was put into getting things right in the first place. And that's one of the key points I was aiming to sort of get across last time, is if you do it right the first time, you're not having to constantly redo it.
Yeah, I also think that Florian's point is good because it gives you an example of the kind of cadence of change. You know, cars, people have them for maybe a decade or so, and there are things you can change on it, but normally you stick with the chassis and the shell, and maybe you change the radio or something. Aeroplanes, similarly, yes, there are new things coming out, and there are more efficient engines, there are more efficient airframes and new materials, but people aren't taking engines off of existing planes to put the new ones on. They're bringing entirely new planes in. And so I think where we were talking about bridges and buildings, which are really fixed and the technology for them moves very slowly, then you look at the cars or the phones, you know, which are also engineering, true, but they change a lot more quickly. And so there's this sort of difference as well in operating systems and software. So perhaps the operating system is the house and the software is the phone. And so some of them move very quickly and are updated, whereas other ones you expect to be around for a long time. And when changes are needed, in the sort of double glazing analogy, you need to be able to make that change rather than destroy the house and rebuild it. So I think the engineering analogy does work quite nicely, because some things are updated all the time and the whole thing gets changed, and some things are updated and you just change a little aspect of it.
Well, let's change tack a bit and go back to talking about the Pi. And John got in touch and said, you summed up much of my adventures with the Pi over the last couple of years. For me, the main attraction of these small devices is low power consumption, mainly because my wife simply refuses to allow me to leave full-size gear running 24/7. It took me a long time to realise that I also had to learn about the I/O bottleneck that was the root of my media viewing problems. I now use no Droid C2 as the heart of my NAS and use Pis as media servers. I'm still running a Pi as my main router, managing my internet connection. At best, with the firewall I'm running, I only get 35 megabits a second through my Pi, not the full 50 megabits per second my ISP claims, but this seems more than fast enough. Also, I recently decided to set up another of the Pis languishing in the drawer as a Pi hole, mainly to see if installation was as straightforward as claimed. It was. And John then linked to the Pi-hole website for us. He continued, the Pi's rich support environment is another draw for me. Getting the Odroid C2 up and running properly was challenging, and I'm frustrated that the newest kernel I seem to have access to is from the 3 series. I have a USB wireless device I'd like to use with it, but no driver. And I also worry about the potential for long-term support. I feel that when the maker releases the next great thing, support will dry up. However, for now I'm okay, and it wasn't a huge investment initially.
So there's a number of things I'd like to break down from his post there. So firstly is the fact that he's happy to get 35 megabits a second limited by a Pi rather than the full 50. Seems entirely against how I would view things. if my ISP gives me 50, I'll have hardware that can do 100 so that I'm not limiting the bandwidth. But, I suppose it's horses for courses and choices. I also have a Pi hole set up, sat next to my router. So I've got it so that the way the Pi hole recommends setting up is that you forward your DNS queries from the router to the Pi hole, and the Pi hole has this huge list in its hosts file of websites and basically advertising websites that it blocks. So anything, including tablets and phones, anything on the Wi-Fi, anything on your network, gets all these adverts blocked. So it's really useful from that point of view. And thirdly, the talk about the Odroid. So, we've just started talking about the Pi more with Paddy getting a Pi, and Joe and I have obviously mentioned it numerous times and comes up in the news all the time. But we don't really cover a lot of the other devices, these small single board computers like the Odroid C2. And obviously, John's found a use for the Odroid that the Pi, isn't fast enough to work with. So he's had to find those. And I wonder, maybe we should have a think about looking at those Odroids and things, especially if he's using it as the NAS where the Pi's not fast enough. So, yeah, some interesting points there. Thanks for getting in touch, John.
Yeah, and Laurie also got in touch to tell us about her use cases for the Pi, which I guess just goes back to what we said originally, which is it has many use cases and it may not do all of them particularly well, but all of them are available.
Yeah, it just depends on what particular itch you want to scratch and how you put it into action. I think on a future show we'll be covering some of our uses around the house. So we'll definitely come back to talk about the Pi. So Jerry Steele also got in touch saying, regarding SSH security, I recommend putting fail to ban on anything that has an SSH server running. This uses the inbuilt IP tables firewall and iNotify, which watches for changing files. In this case, iNotify watches the auth log to automatically ban IPs that make too many appearances in the log within given parameters. By default, it comes with the SSH rules enabled. Also, Paddy is right that you don't want to be using passwords on an internet-facing SSH server. There's no need for PKI, simple SSH keys will do. Just find a secure way of distributing the pub keys on the relevant servers that you need access to. So this is obviously some advice for me with my server, and I have to admit that the server I say had because I've since formatted it and it's going through a rebuild, but the server I had was sort of an interesting experiment in what is Ubuntu server like, how can I SSH into it remotely, oh look, I can put a web server on it, oh I can try C-file, and these various things, and it became my Plex server and that. So I sort of, I don't want to say I built on top of sand, but I didn't really have much of a plan of sort of locking it down, and it just grew arms and legs as my interest changed. But now that it seems to have fallen over a little bit with the upgrade to Ubuntu 16.04, the LTS, I've decided to take it off, give it a big format, reinstall from scratch, and build it with security at the forefront, or what I can do for security, and then add things after it. So things like fail to ban, things like SSH keys and that will be added, and then subsequently have Plex and things like this. But I did want to ask you, Paddy, about these keys, because I've known about having SSH keys, and I use them on my internal network so that I don't have to type in the password every time to my 2 or 3 Raspberry Pis and to my server. So I just, SSH in, and it auto logs in because I've got the keys, and I've not put passwords on those keys, so I don't have to do any typing. And I wonder about the difference between PKI versus SSH keys. Is there a particular reason you suggested PKI? Why wouldn't I just have SSH keys on like my phone or my laptop so that when I'm out and about, it SSHs in without a password?
I was thinking more about larger environments where you do need the public key infrastructure to sort of manage all this side of stuff for you, to be honest. I mean, for what you're doing is fine, apart from the fact you haven't got passwords on your keys, which is a spankable offence, to be honest.
But within your own network, you still think that's... I mean, none of these computers are internet facing, apart from my server, which is the one that had the password only, which I'm now trying to undo and redo. But surely, so you're saying you have a key and you have a password on that key?
Yes, I mean, I would, certainly, and I do. I think partly it's a matter of habit, and it's a good hygiene to adhere to so that you don't accidentally do it on an external box at some stage just because you're so used to doing it on internal boxes. But the truth is, the way all this Internet of Things stuff is going, and I know you're a big fan of this and have got a variety of devices in your home and no doubt will have more in the future, your internal network is probably going to become an awful lot less secure than it is now. So I would suggest strongly that you start treating it the same way you treat the sort of the threat vectors from outside.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I've only got Tato at the moment. That's my only Internet of Things that I'm thinking of. I've got, Raspberry Pi's doing stuff, but that's all stuff that I've set up and servers and what have you. But I also am aware that when IPv6 becomes the standard, everything will effectively be internet facing because there's no need for a NAT. So you don't need to be having all these, internal network IP addresses versus external network IP addresses. And that is where I think there's going to be, potential security problems everywhere, because I'm saying that my internal network's safe and secure if I had a strong firewall and NAT and all these sorts of things. It is sort of separated. But when you get IPv6, everything is effectively internet facing. So it's going to be a very different world when that happens.
Yeah, what sort of holes they'll want to punch through your firewall at that stage just to get out. I don't know, it obviously depends on the devices, but the world is certainly changing out there. Anyway, let's wrap up the feedback with a comment from Cubicle Nate. And he said, "You've made comments on more than one show about the problems with maintaining a monolithic kernel, and that a microkernel would be preferable. Thanks to you, I decided to do some reading to develop a better understanding of the two. From what I can tell, Linux is not a true monolithic kernel in the strictest sense, because of the loadable kernel modules that can occur during runtime. That would lead me to believe that there could be, if desired, a very tiny Linux kernel that can have all the necessary hardware drivers loaded as needed. So the very core part of the kernel could indeed have its code very well reviewed and tightened up for the removal of any bugs. It's worth noting that macOS is a hybrid kernel and Windows is a microkernel. It seems like historically the monolithic kernel has indeed been more stable than microkernels, but I could be remiss in that conclusion."
So I guess my query from this would be, if his review of a non-true monolithic kernel is correct, should we be just making kernels that are bespoke to our machine and only loading the modules and the drivers that we want in order to have a very, very small attack surface? Or is that just something that people don't do because it's a huge pain in the arse?
I think it's something people don't do because it is a huge pain in the backside, posterior. It's also not entirely accurate in his assumptions here, because it isn't the fact that you can have code sat outside of the kernel that's loaded in that sort of differentiates. It's not the size of the code base that differentiates monolithic and microkernels. It's more to do with what's actually running within kernel space and the context switching that's needed to get from user space to kernel space. And microkernels have very little running in the core, and that's why historically they've been considered quite inefficient, because to do anything that requires kernel activity, which, let's face it, is most things on a box, there's a lot of context switching going on, and that's quite expensive in computing terms. So the fact that the Linux kernel has modules that can be loaded at runtime doesn't mean that it is a microkernel. It just happens to be a monolithic kernel that has loadable modules. So the distinction isn't to do with how the code gets loaded there. It's how it interacts, whether it's in the same context space, the same address space, and what have you.
So he's talking here about mod probe and things like this.
Yes, yeah, that's what I took from his comment. I'll stick a link in the show notes to a talk by Andy Tanbaum on how Minix has evolved and how they've actually implemented NetBSD based on top of that. And even if you're not particularly interested in the BSD side of things, it's worth watching just to get a feel for why microkernels and that approach to architecture could be important. And for most of us running desktops, it isn't, let's be frank. And even a lot of servers out there, it doesn't matter if they aren't entirely reliable. But if you're looking at something that wants to be up for 25, 30, 50 years, whatever, and I'm being quite serious there, and Andy's quite serious there, and if you think about some of the control systems and nuclear power stations or whatever, you really want them to be more reliable than Linux tends to be these days, then it's worthwhile considering these and paying the cost that's involved in all the context switching.
Okay, well, that's the end of the feedback. Let's move it on.
I'm delighted to say that we're joined once again by Elizabeth K. Joseph. So welcome back to the show, Liz.
Hello, thank you.
So last time we talked to you about Ubuntu and to some extent women in tech, but we're not going to talk to you about that this time. We're going to talk to you about a book that you've co-authored called Common OpenStack Deployments, Real-World Examples for System Administrators and Engineers. It's a bit of a mouthful, and it's pretty technical, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So I suppose the obvious question, what is OpenStack?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I decided to write the book to answer. I was going to a lot of conferences and speaking on the OpenStack infrastructure project. So like the whole infrastructure we maintain to make sure OpenStack developers can submit code and get all their work done. So I was talking about this infrastructure, the continuous integration system, and all of this stuff. And then people would come up to me afterwards and say, so you run this infrastructure, but what exactly is OpenStack? So I found myself at all these conferences where there were all these OpenStack conferences and people still didn't really know what it was. So I'd say, well, it makes clouds. But it turns out people use the word cloud to describe everything now. So that was somewhat ambiguous. So I try to go deeper on-demand servers, the ability to grow and shrink your server cluster on demand, and sort of getting into other things you want to interface with that, like adding storage to your instances, your virtual machines, adding databases, adding DNS services, all this stuff you would get if you're using something like Amazon Web Services or Google's compute service. But I kept getting this question, and I was like, I think we need a book about this. So I looked out what books were on the market and sort of came up with the idea of this Common OpenStack Deployments book, sort of to answer the question of what OpenStack is and get you started.
So you talked a bit about demand for a book there, Liz. I mean, what's the history behind OpenStack? Where did it come from?
Yeah, so, you can go back pretty far history-wise, but let's look back just like 10 years. You've got companies offering virtual private servers, VPSs. So people had started moving away from having physical machines in a data center. Like I used to have a physical machine in a data center that we paid for space for. Gradually moved over to VPSs. So someone else was managing the hardware for me. And then we get into sort of the age of Amazon, where you suddenly have the ability to turn on as many machines as you want, and you just pay per hour. So that allows you to scale up your infrastructure on demand and just pay for what you buy rather than buying a bunch of servers. So this became pretty popular. And on the open source side, a bunch of companies got together and said, listen, like Amazon is taking over the world. We want to have an open source product that is very similar to this. So in the early days, you had Eucalyptus, which is what Ubuntu went with, I think in the 8.04 release. And then by 10.04, a few companies, Rackspace and then NASA actually decided at the same time to open source this cloud thing that they were working on. And they sort of realized that they were both going to open source it at the same time. So they got together in the middle of 2010 and said, hey, let's do this together. So they launched OpenStack with much fanfare. They'd been talking to a lot of companies who are also interested in this sort of open source infrastructure for clouds. And a bunch of companies just dove in right away and created OpenStack together. So it started off as a compute service for launching virtual machines and an object storage for uploading individual files to the cloud that can be retrieved through an API.
Yeah, and that's Swift, isn't it? That's
Yep.
still with us today.
Yeah, so we have Nova for compute and Swift.
But it's become a lot more complex now, hasn't it?
Yeah, there are I think we have almost 1,500 Git repositories, and that's over 100 projects. Yeah.
And so you run through setting up a dev stack, which is this sort of single PC that all of OpenStack runs on, and you make it very clear in the book that is for testing and just for trial code and things like this. And then you step up to sort of your first deployment with 2 PCs. So you've got the compute node and the controller node. Can you just explain the interface between those two for our listeners?
Right. So the controller, you can sort of think of it as like the brains of the whole operation. In a real world deployment, you may have a couple of these. But this houses your database, and this is what you interact with all the APIs with. It handles the networking typically, and all kinds of the things that you interact with, including authentication and everything. The compute node has one job, and that is to run your instances, whether they're virtual machines or containers or whatnot. These are kept isolated because you want sort of your control stuff off in one side and then the actual workloads on a separate machine, just because you want these powerhouse compute nodes to be have lots of RAM and have lots of processors so you can run lots and lots of VMs. Additionally, if you pay attention to virtualization technology and security, you'll notice that there are security vulnerabilities all the time in virtualization software. So users breaking out of the root environment and getting into the host, and you don't ever want that to happen on your controller. So it can happen on your compute nodes, and that would be a very bad day for you, but it probably wouldn't ruin your life.
And the way you've been talking about scaling up and down, it's the compute node side that would be the one that scales the most before you start having to upscale the other side.
Yeah, so the controller you'd scale first off just so you have HA, so it's highly available. But the compute nodes, you pretty much just start adding more from day one.
Yeah, and one really good feature of the book, I thought, was that you provided all the steps necessary to build a reference environment and provided scripts, because it is a very complex environment, as you mentioned earlier. And I think without that, anyone coming to it fresh would have a devil of a job knowing whether they're doing something wrong or where something is going wrong if their setup isn't actually running correctly. So I think that's an excellent thing. I presume you've had really good feedback on that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do two things in this book. The one is I saw some of the OpenStack books that were out there already, and a lot of them used very, very developer-centric environments. So they were using Vagrant, which is sort of a laptop virtualization environment, and things that weren't like real. You'd never really deploy something in Vagrant. You'd install it on servers. So I didn't really want to give an example that was using like a developer tooling. So I wanted to give an example of something they could actually use on a real machine. But at the same time, as you say, like I wanted to make sure that they had a known working environment, so that if they didn't want to use their imagination and go off and set up 2 servers and connect them with a switch, that I gave them one that I've tested like 1,000 times as a reference deployment. And then from there, they can sort of branch off and use whatever they want to use themselves, whether it be machines or a different virtualization backend. But yeah, providing that reference deployment was really important to making sure that people could at least complete the exercises as I intended, and then they can go from there.
Yeah, and you use Ubuntu throughout the book. Mm-hmm. I'd never come across Ubuntu Cloud Archive until I actually read this book. I mean, how does that help track OpenStack releases and the Ubuntu release schedule?
Yeah, so with an LTS release, you're going to get the latest version of OpenStack that came out right alongside that release. And that's what's going to stay in the repositories forever. What the Ubuntu Cloud Archive does is it goes along with the LTS release, but it gives you the latest version of OpenStack that's released every 6 months. So for instance, with 1604, you get the Mitaka release of OpenStack. Mm-hmm. With 1610, you get the Newton release of OpenStack. And if you enable the Cloud Archive on 1604, you can then get the Newton release on your old 1604. So it allows you to get the latest OpenStack on the LTS release.
So it's effectively backporting, which isn't done for LTSs, yeah.
Right, and in addition to OpenStack packages themselves, they also backport some other things. So the book uses 1404, and that was just a matter of timing. Like the book would have never been released if I had rebased on 1604, because systemd and a lot of changes with 1604, and I just didn't have time. So it uses 1404, and you might notice if you go through the exercise in the book, it pulls down a bunch of OpenStack packages, but it will also pull down things like libvirt and kvm packages, because some of the OpenStack stuff that's newer requires newer packages of the underlying virtualization technology as well. So that repository is actually doing a whole lot of stuff.
Just staying on the versioning, so with Ubuntu normal desktop version, people often stick with the LTSs. Is it recommended that you stick with the LTS and go LTS to LTS and also whatever OpenStack deployment is associated with the LTS? Or is it recommended to use this cloud service to pull in the newest version of OpenStack?
Yeah, so I definitely say that it's better to use the Ubuntu Cloud Archive and pull in the latest Ubuntu release. Partially because even though Canonical says they will support the OpenStack release, I think they say for 3 years on the LTS. Maybe they say 5, but that's how long Canonical will say they support it. But the OpenStack community itself, like this group of hundreds of companies, they only support a release for 18 months. So for 18 months from the date of release, you get the whole backing of the OpenStack community behind you, upgrading your services and making sure everything's stable and secure. After that, you're relying solely on Canonical to provide security updates, which is fine, but I'd much rather have the herd of companies doing security and rely on that and use the latest version, because then you have that many more eyes on things.
We've talked quite a lot about Ubuntu there, but what about people who are Red Hat or CentOS people, or even brave souls running servers on Arch? I mean, is the book going to help them out, or is it such a different experience there that this is just for Ubuntu users?
So I think the book is still valuable to people not using Ubuntu. The exercises are definitely geared around Ubuntu and the use of things like the Ubuntu Cloud Archive. But the book is using the Puppet modules developed in the OpenStack community. And the Puppet modules support CentOS and Ubuntu out of the box. I'm not sure about other distributions, but definitely CentOS, Red Hat, and Ubuntu. Some degree, I think Debian is also tested on these Puppet modules. And maybe Fedora. I'd have to actually look at what testing's being done on the Puppet modules today. But those two families of things work with the Puppet modules right now. So you could modify my examples in the book to run on something like CentOS. If you're on Arch or Gentoo, I don't know.
Good luck to you.
There's no hope. Yeah.
So I do have one chapter in the book that's like rolling your own OpenStack. I think I call it Your First OpenStack. And that's actually manually running a bunch of commands. Like you run the MySQL command and you run the apt-get install command. A lot of that could be manually altered in order to run it on a different system. So if you just sort of translate the packages I'm having you install into Arch language, and the MySQL commands will be the same, and setting up RabbitMQ, the queuing service that OpenStack uses, that will all be very similar. So you could read through that one chapter and learn what's going on, and then port it over to whatever you're using.
And we've alluded to this already, and several times in the book you mention about components and user interfaces changing over time. I mean, I'm specifically thinking about the move over to Neutron and Keystone migrating over to WSGI. I mean, how stable are the key components at the moment?
So if you asked me that a year ago, my answer would be different.
Isn't that an answer in of itself?
Well, things were changing really, really fast up until about a year ago.
Right.
We had not only that Keystone change, but also the Keystone version 2 to version 3. That's been really rocky for the project. But that's actually stabilized to a great degree. Another one of the big things is that every single service used to have their own Python client. So you'd type Nova image list or Glance image list, and one of them had a dash and the other one didn't have a dash. But every service had their own client. And at some point, everyone in the project was like, listen, this is not good. So they developed OpenStack Client, which I specifically use throughout the book whenever I can. So there's this new now consolidated client that everyone's supposed to be using, or at least migrating to. So the tooling over the past year or so has really been consolidating around some really good core principles and starting to stabilize. So the Mitaka release was a really good release, and the Newton release, I think, focused even less on features and more on stability and maintainability. So I think we're finally reaching this really nice point of maturity where things aren't changing a whole lot. Hopefully. I mean, I went through, I think, 4 releases of OpenStack in the course of writing this book. And I went through the Keystone change and the OpenStack client change. But now I'm finally seeing things kind of calm down.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth pointing out, and you do in the book, that the dev stack, although that will obviously pull down the latest development release for you to work with, just to play about with, you can set that to actually pull down a stable release as well, can't you? So you can actually do that for all those stable releases and see what's changed in between them.
Right. At least I think it goes back 2 or 3 releases. So because they don't want to support the really old ones.
It strikes me that if you look at most professions, you have to kind of stay up to date with changes in whatever field that you're in. But the field that you're in, being a sysadmin, it seems that you've got such a moving target, such shifting ground, that you must just be constantly having to be reading and learning.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, fortunately, like some of the fundamentals pretty much stay the same. And if we look at something like virtualization and even containers, you know, I've been doing the sysadmin thing for 10 years. And I you know, I can arguably say I've been doing containers the whole time because, you know, you've got cheroots back in the day, and then you have things like vServer and started with Zen and KVM, and then Docker is like everything old is new again. There are some new things coming in, like we've got a lot of big data tooling that we've been starting to use, more queuing services. And of course you have to learn specific technologies. But yeah, there is still a lot of learning, but it definitely builds upon each other, so I wouldn't say it's that bad.
So my view of sysadmin work is obviously terminals and the classic black with the green code and all that kind of stuff churning away. But in your book, you talk about Horizon, this web interface for both managing the administration side of it and also for the end users. Can you just sort of run us through that as to how that's set up and what you can do with it versus using a command line?
Right. So Horizon, yeah, it's the unified web dashboard. And it's what a lot of the OpenStack, the companies offering OpenStack, will use as their dashboard. So it'll be customized to their company, but it's what you log into when you log into launch instances. So you can launch virtual machines from there. You can make changes to your network. Each project pretty much decides what features they want to put in the dashboard. So some projects expose a lot more. Some of the projects don't put anything in Horizon. They were, depend entirely on the command line or the APIs. But you can do a fair amount of the really basic stuff. I will say that once you get really into OpenStack and using it in your infrastructure, you hardly look at Horizon at all.
Yeah, that was sort of my next question as to how much you use one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, at the OpenStack Summit a couple weeks ago, we did a demonstration where we added some clouds to our infrastructure. And in the course of that, we were given login credentials to each of these new clouds. And the first thing I did was log into the Horizon dashboard. I took a look around and saw what our quotas were and did the things that were really easy to look at, like clicky-wise, to sort of get a feel for it. But then I went straight to the command line and I launched everything from there, just because it was more comfortable using the command line options. And I could more easily sync up exactly what we were doing in production using the same exact environment variables and everything by doing it on the command line. Also, when you start scripting things and doing like automatic scaling of your infrastructure based on whatever criteria, you're going to be doing all of that through the API or through the command line clients. So from an infrastructure point of view, we pretty much only use the command line stuff. I will say that there are users of OpenStack at places like educational institutes, universities, and things that use Horizon extensively because their users are not really command line people. They really just want to be able to click and start an instance and shut it down, and they can do all that really easily through Horizon.
So we've sort of talked about deployments and what OpenStack can do, but is there a way that you can give us some sort of idea of the size of OpenStack? By that I mean sort of how many deployments are there, what's maybe the biggest deployment, how does it compare to its biggest competitor? You mentioned Amazon at the start. So is there any sort of numbers you can give about how OpenStack is used?
Yeah, it's changing all the time. So we don't have numbers on Amazon because they don't release them. So it's really hard to gauge how they're doing competition-wise. I will say that Amazon and Google and Microsoft are still the leaders when it comes to the public cloud, but OpenStack has really shown through when it comes to private clouds. So you've got a lot of companies internally using OpenStack, and we have no idea how many cores they're running on. But there are some definitely who are using hundreds of thousands of cores. There are companies deploying entire data centers using OpenStack. Sort of the poster child for research is CERN, and they've been using OpenStack almost since the beginning. I should probably track down exactly what their usage statistics are at the moment, but they're definitely using hundreds of thousands of cores, I think, as far as it's a lot of servers.
Wow, yeah. And I remember a while ago there was the Orange Box was announced. I know that's not directly something that you're involved with. Is that something you know about, or like are they popular? Are they well used?
Yeah, so the Orange Box and other similar sort of OpenStack in a box, they're really good for demonstrating things because they sort of give you your compute node and your controller node, and they are just drop-in deployments. I think the overwhelmingly more common thing to do is just use commodity hardware and build your own. And also that's cheaper and it doesn't have to be orange.
But you do need a fair bit of hardware, don't you? I mean, I was talking to Paddy about this, and his laptop just was not even up to the dev environment.
Yeah, so I think I require for the dev environment like 8 gigs of RAM. And I think DevStack won't install with... I think we now need 6 gigs of RAM for DevStack to even install. Yeah, it's a pretty hefty thing. Because you have to run all these OpenStack services. You also need to run a queuing service because the OpenStack pieces don't just talk to each other directly. They put messages on a queue, and then the queue is picked up by the other services, just so it doesn't lose anything, or if it gets behind, it can sort of catch up. So it's got the MySQL database for a lot of the services. So there's a lot going on. Plus, you actually need to run instances. So you want to spin up your VMs. And even the smallest one, you need 100 megs of RAM to run a little tiny Linux install these days.
And what have you got, Paddy? 2, is it? 3?
No, it's got 4 in this one.
Yeah. Yeah, all my work laptops now have 16, which gets me by.
We talked a few times about how OpenStack seems to be ever growing and encompassing more capabilities. I mean, you mentioned in the book about Ironic and provisioning and management of bare metal. Does this feed into the sort of comments that Mark Shuttleworth made recently, where he was suggesting that maybe OpenStack ought to be sticking to its original goals? Or do you think that's just sour grapes because you begin to tread on his territory?
Well, I think he got some of the services wrong. He mentioned Trove specifically as one of the ones he thought was superfluous. But I think, and Trove is the database as a service. I personally think that one is actually really important to cloud deployments, and it's one that's offered by a lot of providers. But I think stepping back and broadly speaking, he had some good points with regard to OpenStack taking on way too many things and focusing on too many features. And I think this came about just because a lot of companies were really excited to get an OpenStack and they wanted to make their mark. So they made their mark by going off and doing their own thing or by creating new features or creating new things because they could then put their name on it. Which is a very reasonable thing for a company to do. But in the ecosystem of OpenStack, it didn't work very well because we actually want companies investing in the core and focusing on making sure there's stability in the central services before adding a whole lot on top of it.
Yeah, and that's something that comes through in your book very clearly, is that you're concerned about the open source nature of this and keeping that. Whereas obviously there's a lot of vendors out there selling value add and proprietary bits and bobs to stick on top, aren't there?
Right.
So is there some sort of governance? Is there a goal? Is there a foundation or what have you that says this is what we're going to do? It sounds like it's quite a number of disparate groups who seem to be doing their own thing.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So OpenStack used to be very restrictive as to what projects were allowed in and to be called OpenStack. So that was about 2.5 years ago. There was a technical committee. They would review the maturity of a project based on various criteria, and then they would sort of bless it, and it would become part of OpenStack under the OpenStack namespace. Everything else was put into a different repository called StackForge. And then once it graduated to becoming part of core, it became part of OpenStack. This was problematic for lots of reasons we don't have time to get into. So they started this big tent model where just everything is part of OpenStack, but there still is a technical committee. And the technical committee does this similar review of projects and their maturity and gives it their blessing as a project that has now come under the tech committee's governance. So everything is OpenStack, but some things are a little bit more special or OpenStack.
Is it sort of like the best rises to the top, and therefore they're the ones that get the blessing?
Yeah, and one of the, but it also allows competing projects that do the same thing. One of the big things was telemetry. The earliest telemetry project made certain design decisions, and so later telemetry projects that came up that made different decisions, they couldn't really break into the official space because there was already an official project. So one of the reasons they wanted to broaden this was they wanted, like, say, competing telemetry projects to be able to all be official, but it was really hard in that old model. So now we've got a much better telemetry environment, and they're all sort of official projects because they've all met some sort of barrier of maturity.
So time gets away from us. We could talk a lot more about this, but I think we better think about wrapping it up. So if people want to buy common OpenStack deployments, real-world examples for system administrators and engineers, where's the best place for them to go and find it?
So the publisher's website is informit.com. You can also go to deploymentsbook.com. That's the book website where I have a blog, and there's a link there to buy it. Also, it's released by a big publisher, so you can grab it on Amazon or whatever bookseller you want, really.
Okay, great. And there's an ebook version as well, isn't it? It's not just a Dead Trees one.
Right. Yeah, you can grab the ebook from the publisher's website, and it's also on the Kindle. Oh, it's also on Safari Books, so if you have a subscription.
Yeah, well, we'll put some links to that in the show notes. Yeah, it's been excellent talking to you, and hopefully speak to you again at some point.
Great, thanks. This was fun.
Well, from my point of view, it was great to actually meet Liz this time, meet in the sort of internet sense of the word, because I wasn't around for the first interview. And, she was really, really fascinating and had a lot to say about a topic that I have to admit we've covered on this show. We've discussed it in the news, but I've never really got into how OpenStack works and the various technologies behind it. So reading through her book and then get the opportunity to pick her brains was absolutely brilliant. And, I definitely learned a lot. I'm sure you did, Joe, and Paddy sounds like he's up to speed on OpenStack.
Yeah, pretty much what you said there. It's something that I was aware of but didn't really understand very well. And now I feel that although I'm not exactly going to have my own OpenStack deployment tomorrow, it's certainly something I've got a lot more understanding of thanks to Liz. So yeah, it was great. But with that then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter at Linux Luddites or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or you can always leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
See you later.